Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. The Washington Post says the world is going to end in 9 years, and the New York Times says it's time to panic about the climate. But in a recent New York Times article, they say that only 1% of voters consider climate change to be their top priority, which means that 99% of voters don't consider climate change the top priority. That seems odd if the world's actually going to end 9 years from now. So the New York Times is continuing to attempt to create panic about climate. They say summers in Maricopa County, Arizona have become at times unbearable. The evidence that a climate crisis is well underway appears to be everywhere. The Great Salt Lake in Utah drying up, severe weather regularly imperiling the electric grid in Texas, wildfires scorching the drought-plagued West, climate refugees seeking higher land in Louisiana, and tidal floods swamping the streets of Miami. Let's take a look at the New York Times evidence for a climate crisis and see if it makes any sense. They say summers in Maricopa County, Arizona have become at times unbearable. I started college in Maricopa County, Arizona this month in 1974 at Arizona State University. That summer, Phoenix had their all-time record heat wave of 18 consecutive days over 110 degrees. In the middle of Phoenix's record heat wave in 1974, Time magazine ran this article, Another Ice Age. And they said, telltale signs are everywhere. Since the 1940s, the mean global temperature has dropped about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the same language the New York Times is now using for global warming. The evidence that a climate crisis is well underway appears to be everywhere. The reality is that Maricopa County is the fastest growing county in the United States and is now the fourth most populous county in the country. The population of Maricopa County is 4 times larger now than it was when I went to school there in the 1970s. But hardly anybody lived there before 1950. It was the widespread availability of air conditioning which made it possible for people to move to extremely hot Maricopa County, Arizona. The reality is that summers in Maricopa County, Arizona have always been unbearable. In 1985, I broke up with my fiancée in Phoenix because I had no intention of spending my summers there. I took a job 100 miles away at 6,000 feet where the temperatures were about 30 degrees cooler. The New York Times is trying to make it sound like the weather in Arizona is something new, but it's always been like that. Now let's look at their other evidence for a climate crisis. They say the Great Salt Lake in Utah is drying up. But the Great Salt Lake in Utah has been drying up for a very long time. Between 1894 and 1902, the Great Salt Lake lost 6 feet of elevation. On August 6, 1902, it was reported that Utah has been in a dry cycle for 17 or 18 years. And between 1850 and 1950, the Great Salt Lake lost nearly 50% of its volume. So this claim by the New York Times is fake news. Their second line of evidence is that severe weather is regularly imperiling the electric grid in Texas. But as USA Today reported on February 22nd of last year, it's actually reliance on wind power which is causing problems with the Texas grid. On February 12th of last year, USA Today was bragging that up to 2/3 of Texas energy output in 2020 was driven by wind power. But 2 days later, the wind stopped blowing, the wind turbines froze up in extremely cold weather, and the grid in Texas shut down. This article from Reuters was published 11 years ago today, August 4th, 2011. It said, Texas has the most wind power in the country, but the wind does not blow during the summer. So the problem with the Texas grid is the exact opposite of what the New York Times is claiming. Texas' problem is that their government fell for the green energy scam. The next line of evidence from the New York Times reads, wildfires scorching the drought-plagued West. But the reality is that the West is having an extremely wet summer. Even parts of California are getting a lot of rain, which is extremely unusual during the summertime. Burn acreage in the United States this year has been about 5 million acres, which is about 1/10 of the burn acreage from 1930 and 1931. So once again, more fake news from the New York Times. Now let's look at their next line of evidence. Climate refugees, in quotes, seeking higher land in Louisiana. If we look at the NOAA sea level map for the United States, we can see these two red dots in Louisiana. Those are the only two red dots in the United States, which means that sea level appears to be rising very quickly there. Meanwhile, in Alaska, the dots are blue, which means that sea level appears to be falling very quickly there. The problem is that tide gauges don't actually measure sea level rise. They measure changes in the difference between the level of the ocean and the level of the land. In Alaska, the land is rising, so sea level appears to be falling. And in Louisiana, the opposite is occurring. The land is sinking, so sea level appears to be rising. In New Orleans, the land is sinking about 1 inch every 3 years. The main reason this is occurring is because of man-made changes to the Mississippi River. In 1927, the Mississippi River had the worst floods in U.S. history, and the region was flooded for 6 months. After those floods, lots of levees were built, which changed the behavior of the river. Previously, floodwaters would spread sediment and replenish the land in southern Louisiana, but that's not occurring anymore. So once again, this claim from the New York Times is fake news. And apparently they know that because they put climate refugees in quotes. Now let's look at their last claim. Tidal floods swamping the streets of Miami. This is what Miami looked like in September of 1926, right before the record flooding on the Mississippi River, which we just talked about, started. They had a hurricane which destroyed Miami and was America's inflation-adjusted most expensive natural disaster. Miami is very flat and is just above sea level. As a result, if the wind's blowing towards the coast, they can get flooding in Miami. There's nothing new about this. This is what President Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate looked like in September 1926. This animation of Google Earth imagery shows the beach at Fort Lauderdale in 1995 and 2020. You can see that the beach hasn't changed significantly and may in fact be a little bit larger now than it was 25 years earlier. The 1960 movie Where the Boys Are began with this imagery of the beach at Fort Lauderdale. And this is what that same beach looks like now. There's no evidence of sea level rise over the last 60 years. All of the claimed evidence for climate change in this New York Times article is fake news. So it's not surprising that 99% of voters are not impressed by the New York Times propaganda. And that is the real consensus about global warming. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on these scamsters for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Toki and Upala on the web at realclimatescience.com.